welcome to the Oxford Martin School. My name's Charles Godfrey, I'm the director, and we're here due to the generosity of Jim Martin and the Martin family. It's a great pleasure to welcome Carl Benedikt Frey this evening. Carl has been involved with the school for a long time. He's an Oxford Martin City Fellow, and he co-directs our programme on technology and employment, and is also an economic associate of Nuffield College and a senior fellow in the programme on employment, equity and growth at the Institute of New Economic Thinking. Carl is interested in many things. I guess his research chiefly focuses on the transition of industrial nations to digital economics and the subsequent challenges for economic growth, labour markets and urban development. And in partnership with the programme we have with Citigroup, he works to help global leaders navigate the rapidly changing world economy. Carl's going to be talking this evening on saving labour, automation and its enemies. And it's work that sort of begun in 2013 in a very famous paper that has generated vast interest around the globe, and will be the subject of a book which is now with Princeton University Press and will be out in June. Final thing I should say is that this lecture, it's the last in this term's series on evolving economic thought, and it will be filmed and is live webcast. So Carl, can I invite you to the stage to give your lecture?
Thank you very much, Charles. It's a great pleasure to be back again, a few meters away from my office. But I think actually the last time I spoke here was actually back in 2013, after we had published this paper together with my colleague Michael Osborne, where we tried to assess how exposed current jobs are to future automation, given rapid advances in mobile robotics, artificial intelligence, and so on. And I think I've actually struggled to go to a single conference or meeting without being asked about the 47% over the past few years. While it's always nice as an academic that your work is read and discussed, it can be slightly annoying if people have severely misunderstood it. And what I've been trying to do in this book, which I'm going to draw a bit upon in my talk today, is to actually give my view of what I think that this transformation means, because a lot of people have taken our work to suggest that 47% of jobs are going to disappear in a few decades, and they're going to be widespread technological unemployment as a result. And I certainly don't have a deterministic view of the future. I think it very much depends on what we choose. And I think it also depends very much on attitudes towards technological progress itself, what we actually believe. And I will try to convince you of that during my presentation here today. Saving Labour was actually meant to be the title of my book, which is now called The Technology Trap. And the reason that it's not called Saving Labour is that my publisher said, well, everybody in the United Kingdom will just take it to mean saving the Labour Party, so they may be slightly disappointed when they open the book. But I think this is a sufficiently intelligent audience to understand what the title means with the subtitle as well, because saving labour, automation is about saving labour, and frequently in history, labour has been trying to save itself from automation. So there's this bit of a sort of two meanings to saving labour in this context. Now, a few of you will know that back in 2012, Bill Gates noted that innovation is faster than ever before, but yet Americans feel more pessimistic about the future. And this statement has been widely quoted in many different discussions. And what has become known as the Gates paradox, I will suggest to you, is not very much of a paradox indeed. It is a paradox if you take the very long view, because Standard narrative, and this is probably the first slide I saw as an economic history undergraduate about 15 years ago now, which suggested that over millennia growth was essentially stagnant. But around 1800, a miracle happened, right? After that, humans got richer and ever richer thereafter. We got onto this self-reinforcing cascade of progress that created the modern world. The standard narrative here is what happened around 1800 was the British Industrial Revolution, which is largely the same as the rise of the mechanized factory, which replaced the domestic system, and with it, the artisan shop. And the mechanized factory, with its more extreme divisions of labors, workers specializing in very narrow tasks, and employing machinery to aid them in those tasks, was what rose productivity enormously. And in this light, the Gates paradox can seem like a paradox indeed, but what did people actually say and think at the time? In 1844, Benjamin Disraeli, before he became Prime Minister of Britain, published a novel called Coningsby, in which one character remarks, "I see cities peopled with machines. Certainly Manchester is the most wonderful city of modern times." The very same year as Coningsby was published, Friedrich Engels published his Conditions of the Working Class in England, which draw upon his experience of precisely Manchester. And he had a very different take of what was going on in Britain at the time. He argued that machinery serves to reduce people's wages, and he stressed that the English middle class prefers to ignore their concerns and that they grow rich on their misery. The truth is that Friedrich Engels was broadly right at the time he was writing. For the first 7 decades of the Industrial Revolution, output per worker rose enormously, almost by 50%. Over the same period of time, weekly wages rose by 12%. And that doesn't take into account that actually working hours expanded by roughly 20% over the same period of time. So it's not an exaggeration to suggest that wages were probably even falling for parts of the population in real terms. Now, the wage data over this period is admittedly shaky, but I think it's important to note that also other indicators of material well-being provide a similar picture. If we look at consumption, food consumption over this period, most evidence suggests that it declined. If we look at biological indicators such as height, which is often used as an indicator for material well-being, the cohorts born in 1850 was shorter than the cohorts born in 1750. And if we look at consumption on non-essentials among agriculture workers and farm laborers, agriculture workers and factory workers, consumption or spending on non-essentials declined over this period of time. And those first 7 decades were what the economic historian Robert Allen has called Engels' pause, the period Engels observed and wrote about. And this was, in many ways, an extraordinarily transformative period. Words speak louder than documents, and words like factory, words like industry, words like steam engine, words like railroad first emerged in our vocabulary during this period. But so did strike, so did working class, so did Luddite, and so did communism. And during this period, working people expressed their anxiety about the changes that were going on in the labor market in different ways. They expressed it in verse, like the foreign one. They expressed it violently by rioting against the mechanized factory, by going out and smashing machines. And it is important to remember that what began with the mechanized factory and ended with the arrival of the railroads also ended with the arrival or the publication of the Communist Manifesto. Revolutionary technologies brought a few political revolutionaries along the way. Now, one question which I'm discussing or very interested in my book is that the 20th century saw relatively few Luddites. And the reason for that can surely not be that technological progress was less rapid. And if we look back further in history, which I won't be able to do with you today, but which I also do in the book, resistance to technological change in many ways has been the norm rather than the exception. While much commentary has focused on the Luddite riots, those were only part of a wave of riots that swept through Europe and even China. In France, in Germany, in Italy, people rioted against technologies that they perceived threatened their skills. And fearing the threat of the below, governments, for the most part, sided with angry workers rather than pioneers of industry. That changed, actually, for the first time in 18th century Britain. And I think that there are three key reasons for that. One is that merchant manufacturers have become a class of growing political influence, and they would have nothing that jeopardized the competitive advantage of Britain in trade, for which machinery was very important. Another one is that there was growing competition across cities and regions as markets became more integrated, and that undermined the political clout of the guilds, which was one of the forces that tried to block mechanization. And the third is that there was growing competition among nation states, and that countries increasingly realized that the military strength depended very much also on their economic muscle. So during this period, the threat from foreign invasion in a way became greater than the threat from below, and so people or governments began to push mechanization forward. Now, and they did that despite a lot of resistance to technological progress. It's important to remember that the Luddites were essentially politically disenfranchised, right? Property ownership was a requirement for vote, and even though they frequently rioted against machinery, the British government on several occasions actually deployed troops against the rioters. So the machinery question was at the very heart of political economy at that time. And the question I'm trying to answer, at least in part, is why is it that in the 20th century we didn't see resistance in the same way? Now, there are probably many reasons for that. Social inventions matter a great deal. But if we take, for example, the welfare state, welfare spending at the dawn of the Great Depression in 1930 was below 1%. The educational system surely helped equip people with the right skills in the labor market and made transition easier, but people who lost their jobs to machinery didn't go back to school. Workers joined labor unions and fought for better working conditions and for better pay, and I'm sure that that is part of the answer. But unlike the guilds that preceded them, they rarely resisted mechanization. And I think that we can't sort of look at this without actually considering what happened to ordinary people due to technological progress during the 20th century. because it's a very different story than what happened in the 19th century. If you take, for example, things like working conditions, we have fairly sparse statistics both for Britain and the United States on accidents that were caused by mechanization and the introduction of machinery during this period of time. But such accidents were surely, or at least evidently, many enough for the New York Times to run out of headlines to describe such incidents. These are a few articles from the 1870s. So you can see here shocking death in machinery, scalped by machinery, crushed by machinery, killed by machinery, killed in the machinery, mangled by machinery, and terribly mangled by machinery. This is for the 1 year in the 1870s. And one thing that technology actually did to factory work with the arrival of electrification is that it hugely improved working conditions. In the early days, factories were essentially jungles of belts and shafts which posed threats to people's fingers, arms, and lives. And what happened with the introduction of the electric motor is that instead of having one centralized power source in the factories, you could equip every single machine with a separate electric motor. So you essentially could cut out much of the sort of threats to people's lives in the factories. And in addition to that, the arrival of electric light made factory more pleasant in general. It reduced pollution, improved levels of oxygen, reduced heat, and when the US printing office asked the employees whether it wanted to continue to use gaslight or electricity, all choose electricity. It's quite telling in itself that people opted for this technology. Also, if you look at the enormous transformation of the labor market, and this is data from the United States, what we see is that there's been an extraordinary decline in hazardous type of jobs, right? Back in 1870, almost 46% of the workforce was employed in agriculture. That share is now down to 1%. Now, people working in the fields had to combat with hazardous weather conditions, with insects, with storms. It was hard physical work. And just by looking sort of at the transformation between jobs, workers shifting from the farms to electrified factories and air-conditioned offices actually hugely understates the transformation that took place. Consider being a farm laborer today, comparing that with being a farm laborer in 1900. It's a completely different job. Today, you sit in your air-conditioned tractor, you can listen to every sort of music you want to listen to. It's the same job, but it's much, much more pleasant. So it seems clear that technology hugely improved working conditions over this period of time. Work didn't just improve the working conditions of ordinary technology. Did not just improve working conditions for ordinary people, it even raised their pay significantly. And one common misconception is that the tractor and motor vehicles replaced people on the farms and forced them into factory jobs in the cities. And it was actually the other way around. The emergence of huge mass production industries allowed people to actually take on better paid, more comfortable jobs in the cities. And as cheap labor dried up in the countryside, mechanization began to pick up in pace. And this is evident from a natural experiment done by Richard Hornbeck and co-authors, which shows that uses the Mississippi flooding, the Great Mississippi Flooding of 1927. And what it shows is that in places where farmland became unusable and cheap labor left for the cities as a result of that, those places mechanized much more faster. So in places where labor shortages emerged, those were much more likely to invest in mechanization. So the fact that wages actually grew in tandem with productivity over this period of time actually also suggests that people saw the benefits of mechanization in their pockets for the most part of the 20th century. And obviously you can see after 1980 that pattern disappears, and we will come back to that later. Now, there is no question that there was many jobs that disappeared. Few of you will know anybody who works as a lamplighter or an elevator operator or a laundress or a car washer or a switchboard operator or a longshoreman for that matter. But those occupations were merely a dent in terms of the number of people they employed relative to the new mass production industries that emerged. And the main redundancy that took place during this period was actually in unpaid work. Some pioneers of industry foresaw this development, and Thomas Edison himself actually predicted in Good Housekeeping back in 1912 that the woman of the future will not be a servant herself. She can, with the aid of electricity, devote herself to more self-fulfilling and constructive fields. And I'm by no means suggesting that mechanization is the only reason for the ascent of women in the labor force. Cultural norms and social factors played an enormous role as well. But we do know that technology is part of the story. And as you can see on this slide here, the proliferation of electric gadgets that entered the home, from refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, washers, dishwashers, microwaves, and so on and so forth, saved enormous amounts of labor in unpaid work in the household. And Jeremy Greenwood and co-authors have estimated that nearly half of the rise in female labor force participation between 1910 and 1970 can actually be accounted for by the mechanization of the household. And that in turn allowed many homes to become to have two income earners, gave significant boost to income of American households. Now, as America got richer, and this is true for for both America and Britain, it also became more equal. And if we look at the trajectories of the Gini coefficient, which you can see here, you can see that inequality declined rapidly between 1850 and 1970, both in Britain and the United Kingdom. Now, most of you will know that there are a variety of factors that are behind that. Thomas Piketty has drawn our attention to the Great Depression, to World Wars. We know that labor unions played a role. We know that the rise of the minimum wage played a role. But economists have also shown that technology itself actually played a significant role in shaping patterns of inequality over these 2 centuries. And much of that depends on whether technologies are replacing or enabling. We can't expect technologies that replaces worker skills and poses a threat to their income will have the same effects on the labor share of income and inequality than technologies that aid workers, make their skills more valuable, or create new tasks for them. So to take one example, the telescope allowed us to look at the moons of Jupiter. It didn't replace any people in any pre-existing tasks. It allowed us to do new things. That is very different from the arrival of the power loom, which replaced handloom weavers, or indeed the arrival of industrial robots, which replaced factory workers. And what I'm trying to argue in the book is that the past few decades are more similar to the first industrial revolution than to the period of the 20th century in this regard. What you can see on this slide here is that for both men and women at all levels of education, wages rose rapidly up until the 1970s, when the oil price shock emerged. They then stagnated for roughly a decade. And since 1980, wages for unskilled Americans, particularly men who would have taken on factory jobs back in during the post-war boom years, have fallen for 3 consecutive decades. So there's enormous transformation that has taken place in the labor market. And traditional economic theory can't really explain this. Economists used to model technological change as a purely augmenting form. That means that the wages of skilled workers can rise more rapidly than those of unskilled people, but wages will still rise for everyone. But clearly, that has not been the case as of lately. And one reason for that is the arrival of more sophisticated automation technologies. Much of this is linked to pervasive trends in the labor market. And as quite a few of you will probably have heard, there's been a lot of talk about the disappearance of middle-income jobs. And this is a phenomenon that is not just British or American. It is something that is taking place across the board. And at the same time as we've seen the decline of these middle-income jobs, we've seen job growth in high-skill domains and job growth in low-skill domains. And what these middle-income jobs have in common is that they are intensive in routine, rule-based activities which can easily be specified in computer code and therefore readily automated. And as the price of computers, or the cost of computing, has fallen dramatically since the 1980s, these jobs have been shredded. Now, the consequence of that has not been widespread technological unemployment, as many people believed back in the 1960s, when we also, very much like today, had this episode of automation anxiety. And one reason for that is that as technology has replaced people doing routine work, it has complemented, it's provided, made the skills of people in professional services and skilled workers more productive. So for a lawyer or for a consultant or for an academic, I benefit hugely from statistical programs such as data. It allows me to run analysis much more faster and more productively, but it hasn't replaced me in my work. It has made me more productive. And what happens is that as we become more productive, we are also able to earn better wages. And what happens when one skilled new job is created in a city like Oxford is that those people go out in the local service economy and spend their money on services, take a taxi, go to grocery shopping, and so on and so forth. And that creates, on average, 5 new low-skilled jobs in the local service economy. And those trends together have contributed to this polarization of the labor market. Now, the question which is arguably more interested is, what does the future hold in this regard? Because the next 3 decades must certainly not mirror the past 3, right? Engels was right about the period he observed, but it was certainly wrong about the century that followed. And I think we need to be very humble when predicting the future. Now, there are different ways to speculate about the future. And what economists usually do is that we take a data set and extrapolate from current trend. Now, when you think about automation, that is clearly not the way to do it, right? If you would have looked at, employment opportunities for laundresses back in 1910 and used that approach, you would have concluded that there would be abundance of jobs for men and women washing clothes. If you had looked at trends in technology and noticed that the arrival of the electric washing machine, you would probably have inferred that the future employment prospects of people doing laundry doesn't look that bright. And very much in this spirit, Herbert Simon actually made some rather accurate predictions about the future work back in 1960 simply by looking at what computers do. He argued that computers have a comparative advantage in routine type of work, and therefore those jobs will be likely to disappear. He predicted a continued rise of professional services, and he also predicted the continued rise of in-person type of jobs that require face-to-face communication. And in essence, he predicted this sort of polarization of the labor market I showed you earlier 2 decades before it happened. And he was not alone in this regard. The Bureau of Labor Statistics noted in case studies that mechanization has created a lot of dull routine jobs in mass production industries. But automation is not an extension of this trend, it's actually a complete reversal of it. It promises to cut out exactly those jobs created by mass production industries during the early part of the 20th century. So what Mike and I set out to do back in 2013 is try to speculate about in which domains computers have the comparative advantage today, because needless to say, that is something that has continuously evolved. And if you go back to the early 20th century, any distinction between humans and computers would actually have been completely meaningless. Humans were computers. A computer was an occupation often performed by women, which consisted in doing basic arithmetic and tabulating the results. Now, such routine work, as I mentioned earlier, has long been taken over by computers, but many tasks that are arguably not routine or rule-based are within sort of the scope of automation technology today. Driving a car is not a routine activity. We constantly encounter new situations, and it would be completely unfeasible for a programmer to write a set of rules that would predict what all the sort of different situations that we can encounter in traffic. So the way we've sort of dealt with this is that instead, through bottom-up, top-down programming, we use bottom-up machine learning to predict what a human would have done in a given situation. Using large data sets on humans driving, computers are now becoming increasingly good at predicting what we would have done in a given situation. And this has opened up new opportunities for replacing workers in a variety of domains, not just in driving cars, but in translation work, medical diagnostics, document review, so on and so forth. Now, I'm not going to do a complete repeat of my 2013 lecture here, which is 5 years, well, almost 6 years old now. But I think it's still useful to, as a conceptual framework, to think about the future of work in terms of where the comparative advantage lies between what humans do and what computers are capable of. And I'm an economist by training. I was extremely fortunate to have gotten to know Mike Osborne, who I wrote this paper with, who is currently on leave. And much of this actually goes to the work that he had been doing, because as I was writing economics papers at the time, he was developing precisely the algorithm that has the potential to replace us in some of these tasks. So what we did is that we gathered a group of people at the Engineering Sciences Department, and the question that we asked is, well, despite of all this, the arrival of machine learning, and in which domains will human workers still hold the comparative advantage? And people were fairly in one view of that creativity is very hard to automate. And some people in the machine learning community have pointed out that, well, algorithms doing classical music, and there are machines drawing paintings that have been exhibited at Tate Modern, and all sorts of things. And there is no question that machines are able to generate something new and something original, but I think that conflates originality with creativity. So we just, you can certainly feed an algorithm, a data set of symphonies and label them and say that these are the Mozart symphonies and they are the best of all times, and the algorithm will come up with some new recombination of those symphonies. But doing that, you're not going to arrive at Stravinsky or Schoenberg. And the reason for that is that we don't just draw upon, old pieces of music when we develop things. We draw upon experience from all parts of life. So a lot of the things that are related to creativity are outside the data set we're able to provide for those tasks. And the same is true when it comes to complex social interactions. And I think probably the state of the art here is best described by the Turing test, where chatbots interact with human judges and try to convince them that they are a person. And some people argued, actually, the year after our 2013 paper came out, that we underestimated the potential scope of automation, because one chatbot actually that year managed to convince 30% of human judges of it being a person. But it did so by pretending to be a 13-year-old boy speaking English as his second language. And if you think about the variety of much more complex social interactions you do in your daily jobs, where you try to convince people that you're right, you try to motivate your colleagues, you try to negotiate deals, all of these things are very far off from being automated away. And the last bottleneck is maybe slightly less intuitive, but no less important. It relates to the perception and manipulation of irregular objects. So if I want to pick up this glass and take a sip of water, the first thing I need to do is that I need to distinguish the object from the background, which is tricky in this case because the glass is transparent, you can see through it. And the second thing I need to make sure is that I apply the right amount of pressure when I pick it up in order not to break it. And you can certainly have a single-purpose robot that is capable of doing that over and over again. But if you think about the variety of objects you have in your home, it's almost inconceivable that in the near future we will have a general-purpose robot that is able to distinguish and manipulate all those sorts of objects. So just sort of simple things like distinguishing, a piece of paper I've recently written from rubbish. Well, straightforward to me, but probably not even as straightforward to my wife sometimes. So clearly there are certain things that we even struggle to define and communicate, and those tasks remain largely outside the realms of computers. Now, what we estimated back in 2013 is that roughly 47% of jobs are at high risk of automation. And that essentially means that they are not very intensive in tasks that involve creative work, complex social interactions, and the perception and manipulation of irregular objects. And as you can see on this slide here, most job categories are actually to some extent exposed to automation. So it's no longer routine production jobs that are replaceable. Jobs in transportation, logistics, services, retail, office, back office work, all of those domains are highly exposed to future automation. But what those jobs have in common is that nearly all of them, or at least most of them, are low-paid, low-skilled work. So despite all of these anecdotes you hear that robots will take, or algorithms will take the jobs of lawyers and doctors and so on and so forth, it is certainly true that algorithms have a comparative advantage in some tasks doctors do, but they're very unlikely to replace the entire job. Low-skilled, low-income jobs are much more replaceable overall. And if you remember one slide I showed you earlier, there has been a tendency of wages for the unskilled to fall for almost 3 decades now. And if we think that those jobs, those groups in the labor market are most likely to be replaced by automation looking forward, I think that there are reasons to be concerned about a potential backlash against technology itself. Now, the concern is not so much that there aren't enough jobs. New jobs are being created. And this is some work we've done since then, looking at new occupations emerging in the United States by looking at very detailed statistical classifications. So you have roughly 10,000 jobs categories which are updated every decade. And you can do string matches to look at the new types of work that has arrived decade by decade. And what you can also do is that you can look at where those new jobs have appeared. And as you can see, as late as the 1970s, so where it says 1980, that's actually 1970 to 1980, new jobs appeared almost across the board. Actually, quite a lot of new work still emerged in cities that specialized in routine, sort of rule-based manufacturing. But since the 1980s, there's been quite an extraordinary reversal in the clustering of new jobs in places that specialize in knowledge work. So new jobs tend to overwhelmingly cluster in places that with an initial abundance of skilled workers. At the same time, what we see is that we look at technologies like industrial robots, those tend to be highly clustered as well, but in very different places. So if you look at robot exposure in the United States, not so surprisingly, perhaps, a lot of them cluster in the Rust Belt. And that is indeed also where the 2016 general election mostly played out. And in one recent paper, together with Shinshi, who I believe is in the audience, and Thor Berger, we estimate that had the adoption of robot technology being left unchanged since the general election, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania would potentially have swung in favor of the Democratic candidate, leaving Hillary Clinton with a majority. Now, such counterfactuals shall always be taken with a pinch of salt, but it is quite clear that when controlling for a variety of alternative explanations, automation actually explains quite a bit of the discontent that people are now facing. Now, most of you will have noted that there has been a recent backlash against globalization. And globalization has surely played an important role in many of the trends that I've discussed today. But automation has actually been just as important. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Leontief once suggested that if horses could have joined the Democratic Party and voted, what would have happened on the farms might have been different. I'm not sure whether that's right or not. What I do know is that the adoption of tractor technology was very gradual for a variety of reasons, but attitudes towards automation was not one of them. But as I tried to highlight earlier, attitudes towards technology has actually shaped the adoption of new technologies in the past. And if we look at recent survey evidence about what people in the United States actually think about automation, attitudes seem not to be all that positive. A majority of Americans today actually favor policies to restrict the number of jobs companies can automate away. And while I'm not here to predict another Luddite riot, I think that we need to take this seriously, especially in the light of the recent backlash to globalization. And it's important to remember that most people today work in non-tradable sectors of the economy, but many of those sectors are actually highly exposed to future automation. And as automation progresses, it is not entirely unfeasible that the focus will shift from globalization to automation. Now, I don't know what the future holds, but I believe that what people believe matters. And if a large share of the population have unfavorable attitudes towards automation, it seems to me not entirely unlikely that that might slow down the pace of change. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks very much for a fascinating talk, Carl, and look forward to Frey's pause entering the lexicon along with Engels' pause. We have some time for some questions, and let me remind you that we are being recorded. So, a woman in a white jersey there.
Thank you for your talk. So I'd like to ask, as you said before, middle-skilled workers will suffer most, while more high-skilled and low-skilled will emerge. Do you think that this will create a bigger inequality gap? If yes, what's the best way to tackle this problem?
So it's an excellent question. So I don't think that there's one way to tackle it. I think that there are many ways that play a role in this, and I think that we need to distinguish carefully about inequality between the 1% versus the 99%, and inequality within the 99%. So within the 99%, I think most has to do with skill-biased technological change and routine-biased technological change. So the replacement of middle-skilled jobs and technology favoring relatively skilled people. And there I think, the educational story is reasonably straightforward, right? Provide people with the right skills and incomes will converge as a result of that. Now, that is obviously easier said than done. It's an approach that can take years or decades to play out. And I think that much of the failure of people to adjust to technological change is not just educational or occupational, right? So I think that the unevenness of new job creation and job displacement has a large part to play in this story in terms of geography. So if we look at worker mobility across state lines, both in Europe and in America, it has been in decline actually since the 1980s. So skilled people tend to move, unskilled people tend not to move. And one reason for that, I think, is first of all, moving is an investment, right? It requires liquidity up front in order to potentially get a job later on. Not everybody has liquidity to move to a new place, certainly not if they don't have a job lined up. Secondly, those of you who live in Oxford and London will have noted that housing costs are quite significant. And what happens when sort of skilled jobs cluster in places is that, well, due to the labor multiplier, most low-skilled service jobs tend to follow there as well, because, you know, new jobs, service jobs emerge, whereas there is demand for them, right? But because house prices go up, that makes it more and more difficult for people to actually be able to afford to live where the jobs are. So I think expanding housing, transportation infrastructure to allow people to more easily tap in to booming local labor markets play an important role. And if we look at the sort of 1% versus the 99%, so the biggest story is essentially a housing story, right? So the entire sort of uprise in wealth inequality essentially comes from housing. So by expanding housing supply in skilled cities, you at least sort of counteract that in part as well. And I'm sure there are more creative proposals that I haven't thought of.
Thank you. Question in the front here.
Thank you. So I have a question regarding the interpretation of this 2013 report. So I guess there are two different claims that you might want to make there. So one is sort of a comparative claim regarding which kinds of jobs are more automatable. So you certainly make such claims. You're saying that like more low-skilled jobs are more automatable, right? But then in the media, I think that there was also this sort of more absolute claim that's like, you know, in 2 decades, 47% of jobs will be automated. So I was wondering whether this was something that you actually wanted to say, or whether this was just something in the media reporting, and if you wanted to say it, like, you know, what's your justification for that?
So the phrasing in the paper was at high risk of automation, which means automatable over an unspecified number of years. And there's one formulation in the paper that says over an unspecified number of years, maybe a decade or 2. But in any case, we're only talking about the automatability of jobs, never about actual replacement. And we have a section discussing a variety of factors that are likely to shape the pace of automation as opposed to its scope. So we're only sort of discussing the potential scope of automation, not its pace. And the pace of automation are going to depend on a variety of factors. One, as I tried to argue today, has to do with attitudes towards technological change and, you know, worker opposition to it. One has potentially to do with legislation, right? So I mean, Google Translate is not going to replace translators in large numbers, because for certain documents you need a certified translator. So unless you certify Google Translate, it's not just going to happen. Waiters and waitresses appear as automatable in our estimates. So, I mean, if you go for a quick lunch, you may want to go to Etsy or one of these vending machine restaurants, which are very quick. If you go for a nice meal in the evening, as a customer, you may want to have a human waiter. So, you know, consumer preferences are likely to shape the pace of automation. When Nissan produces cars in Japan, it relies heavily on cheap labor, robots. When it does the same thing in India, it relies heavily on cheap labor. So relative costs between capital and labor matter as well. So there are a lot of things that play into this. And with the tractor example, I find it fascinating how many factors that actually sort of played into the relatively slow adoption of tractors. So It turned out that the tractor was only usable for certain types of crops and soil in the early days. It turned out that the bottleneck to adoption was actually that there weren't sufficiently many skilled operators around, so farmers were very reluctant to invest in expensive machinery, and having some person drive it that had never seen an automobile or driven anything before. So in New York, in the state of New York, actually began to invest quite heavily in education for tractor operators in particular, and that spurred adoption. And in addition to that, installment credit, which allowed sort of people to actually buy tractors outright and sort of pay it off gradually, spurred adoption as well. So there are many factors that play into this, and every sort of technological revolution has been gradual, and I am quite confident that this time will not be different in that regard.
Gentleman in the black t-shirt.
Thank you for both. Actually, I have two short questions. The first one is regarding, as you mentioned, firstly, technology will indirectly complement low-skilled worker because raising demand for high-skilled worker, but at the same time, it push the middle-class workers into the lower end. So I'm wondering what's your stand on the technological impacts on low-wage workers? And the second question is actually to measure and separate the effects of technology aiding some workers and replacing some workers is very difficult, if not possible. If not possible, sorry. So I think, what's your, have you been developing or have you have any current research working on develop index on measuring the effects of technology?
Good question. So the first one, so there's been quite a few studies looking at how people adjust as jobs disappear, right? So if you look at people in routine jobs, as you mentioned, those with higher levels of education have adjusted quite well, and many have shifted into jobs of better pay. Low-skilled workers that have experienced replacement have had a tendency to shift into jobs of lower pay. Looking forward, what our estimates suggest is that low-skilled, low-income jobs are most exposed to automation, which potentially suggests that technological change will replace low-skilled jobs and potentially augment high-skilled workers, and leading to at least in the short run, a growing divergence between the wages of the skilled relative to the unskilled, depending if we assume that the supply of skilled workers remains unchanged, right? So it depends on supply and demand. If we then churn out many more skilled workers, the wage distribution could still become more compressed. So it depends on both supply and demand factors.
Yeah, thank you for an excellent presentation. I was wondering, how do you think that aging and demographic change will play into this?
Right, so that's a very, very good question. So I haven't done any work on that myself, but there is some research, I believe, by Darren S. Mugler, looking at robot adoption and the composition of the workforce in demographic terms, and finding that countries with an older population have adopted robots faster. So clearly there seems to be, an incentive in countries with a more rapidly aging population to invest in automation technology, but I think that's a field that also probably requires further research.
Throughout this presentation, you've spoken of wages as if they were determined entirely by skill. You did just mention now supply and demand, but it would seem to me that wages are often set socially, and we can pay people what we think they need rather than something that's based particularly on their skill level. So is there not a political element to the question of how we treat low-skilled workers as compared to a purely economic question?
I certainly think that's true, but I think those are also intertwined. So I think the more valuable your skills are, the more bargaining power you have, right? So if you think about the lamplighter, for example, so with the disappearance of the occupation of the lamplighter's union disappeared as well. With the disappearance of the occupation of longshoremen, the longshoremen union disappeared as well. There's a New York Times article from, I think, 1964 with the headline, "Automation keeps the system running during a strike by telephone operators," and they argue that nobody even noticed the strike because they simply shifted some of the supervisors to actually run the automated system. So clearly, the bargaining power of switchboard operators declined in response to automation. Now, that doesn't mean that technology is the only factor that drives workers' bargaining power. So I think the ability to organize plays a huge role, and the labor movement clearly took advantage of the fact that their skills became more valuable, especially after the introduction of steam power, which sort of meant that child labor no longer became feasible to use in the factories. So workers with more skills tend to have more bargaining power, and I think unions and other political mechanisms can take advantage of that and bargain for better working conditions. But I think two are very much interrelated.
Is there a last question? In the middle here.
Thank you. There was a slide showing the co-evolutions of real wages of workers and the productivity of workers through a century, I guess. And in that slide, we saw that productivity and real wage co-moved to a relatively large extent until the 80s. And only when 80s stroke, the two started following very divergent paths. So do you think the main reason behind that is automation having changed nature towards destroying middle-skilled jobs? Or do you think there are other factors as well which are largely contributing to this change in trend?
I think it's several factors, but I think so. Offshoring, import competition clearly plays a role in this. Automation is certainly part of the story. So the disappearance of routine jobs has to do both with offshoring and automation. And with more intense foreign competition, there will also growing incentives to mechanize. And I think one reason that actually many unions accepted automation was that the choice was often either to send jobs abroad or automate at home. The latter meaning still some jobs being kept on domestic soil. So I think those two factors are the key drivers.
Okay, thank you very much. Two brief announcements. We have, this is the last of the Evolving Economic Thought lectures for this term. On Monday, we actually have a talk by Dan Hanser-Goodacre on chilling prospects, how to provide cooling for all the world without blowing the world's carbon budget. So on the rise of demand for cooling. And that's at 5 o'clock. Tuesday lunchtime at 12:30, we have Dr. Moritz Kramer talking on global maps of the spread of infectious diseases and their vectors. And do look at our website for some really exciting talks next term on economics. But would you join me in thanking Carl again for a really fascinating and interesting talk?